I can see it. It's good to go.
Perfect. Okay. So there's a lot of things that we want to think about when we're thinking about renovating or establishing a new lawn. And the first is kind of abstract. It's kind of thinking about what are you hoping to get out of a new lawn? What are your expectations, right? So this could vary significantly. Today I gave several talks on a stand that was a mix of tall fescue, Bermuda grass, clover, some thin paspalum, and some people may look at that and go, this is totally unacceptable. I want a turf grass monoculture. But, for the most part today, I think it served its purpose well. It looked very attractive. There was dense coverage of vegetation across that area, no exposed soil. It tolerates mowing. And so, depending on who you are, you may be very content with something that looks good as long as you keep it mowed. Some of us may be a little bit more particular and we may want that traditional turfgrass monoculture, meaning that we have one turfgrass species or one turfgrass variety that's sort of dominant there. So it just really depends. And there is no real right or wrong, I would say. So if your preference is to have something that's mixed, where you've got some clover mixed in, or you have several different types of grass mixed in, and that's your preference, then we would manage to try to create that. If your goal is to have a monoculture, then we would manage to create that. And I think it's really important to think about what you're wanting going into it, because that's going to make a big difference in terms of what we select for planting, how we kind of approach the renovation or establishment process. And the other question is, why are we renovating or establishing a new lawn? We had a lot of interesting things happen in Tennessee from a weather perspective this past year, particularly if we happen to have a warm season grass lawn, meaning that we have Bermuda or we have zoysia grass. We saw those warm season grasses take quite a hit over the winter. And that hit was, exacerbated or made worse by the fact that we had some drought last summer. We had some additional dry periods in many parts of the state leading into December prior to some of those really cold temperatures. And so it's stress on top of stress. And then coming into the spring, we saw that we didn't warm up very quickly. We didn't have a lot of good sunlight. And so again, those warm season grasses didn't really have a great opportunity to recover. On the flip side, if we have a cool season grass lawn, tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass or some combination, we may have seen that those did very well over the past year for the most part, and had optimal conditions to persist a little bit more. And so I've seen a lot of folks, I say all this to say, I've seen a lot of folks interested or by necessity having to renovate or replace sod this year, thinking about, new varieties. I've had a couple of golf courses up in y'all's part of the state, call to say, hey, I think I'm ready to look at something other than Bermuda grass. And so we want to think about what are our goals. And, once we do that, we want to start by choosing the right turf grass for us. And, I'm a turf grass specialist, so we're going to talk a lot about turf grass. But today, when I was at the Fall Gardeners Festival, there were several times where it came up that sometimes turf grass is not the right option. So we can talk about that tonight as well, particularly if we have really dense shade or other hurdles that we're having to overcome. Sometimes we may have to look at other options. So again, it just depends. If I'm wanting to renovate an area because I've got really big trees and I'm not getting grass to grow underneath them anymore, I need to ask myself the question, is that because turf grass just is not going to grow underneath there? So Dr. Brazen, my colleague today, he shared a great anecdote saying, there's not a lot of turf grass growing in the forest, right? So it's not something that we necessarily see in areas where we have a lot of dense shade. So why are we renovating? Choosing the right alternative or the right option for whatever we're putting in. We'll talk a little bit tonight about the importance of soil testing. We'll talk about the importance of preparing a site prior to a renovation or prior to the establishment of a new lawn. We'll talk a little bit about planting. And then at the end, I'll do a little bit of discussion around water and fertilization during establishment. This is a very nuanced topic, but we'll try to kind of dig into that a little bit. So first thing I always like to start off with when we talk about turfgrass selection is we tend to put turf grasses in two categories. And forgive me if for those of you that already know this, but we tend to have warm season grasses and cool season grasses. And these are physiologically different from each other. Another term that we may use in the plant science world is cool season grasses are what we call C3 plants. Warm season grasses are what we call C4 plants. And C4 plants or warm season grasses, they actually comprise a group that only accounts for less than 1% of all the plants on the planet. Cool season plants or C3 plants comprise about 90% of plants on the planet. And then the remaining 9, nearly 10% is a group of plants that have what we call a crassulation acid metabolism. So those are going to be tropical plants and succulents that are extremely water use efficient. So if we kind of compare side by side C4 versus C3 or warm season versus cool season, in general, we're going to see that those warm season grasses, which are going to include things like Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, centipede grass. If you're from other parts of the country, it's going to include St. Augustine grass as well. These grasses tend to be more water use efficient. This has to do with the way in which they photosynthesize. They're just physiologically more water use efficient typically. They tend to be more nitrogen use efficient. Their ideal temperature range for growth is much higher than we would see for cool season grasses. So, for example, we would typically see that shoot growth for Bermuda grass is really going to be optimal between about 85 and 95 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's quite warm. And, depending on what county we're in here in Tennessee, we may not get actually as many days as we think in those temperatures. And so it, prompts the question, is Bermuda grass the best option for some lawns here? We do tend to see, because warm season grasses are more water use efficient, they tend to be a little bit more drought hardy. And they also tend to have good stress recovery, which is like a really polite way to talk about how invasive they can be. So, anybody that's had to pull Bermuda grass stolons or runners out of their beds before, how frustrating Bermuda grass can be. But those characteristics lend themselves to these warm season grasses recovering much better, basically being able to self-heal if they experience injury. Whereas a lot of our cool season grasses tend to have more of a bunch type growth habit. So Bermuda grass and zoysia grass in particular, they're both what we call rhizomatous and stoloniferous. That means that they can put out lateral stems above and below ground. And so, again, it can be a big plus. Sometimes it can be a little too much of a plus, right? Depending on what we're looking for. Cool season grasses tend to be a little bit less water use efficient, although I'll talk a little bit tonight. There's a lot of effort being put into breeding improved turf type fescues and other cool season grasses to be a little bit more heat and drought tolerant. So there's a lot of progress happening there where we see these grasses maybe performing a little bit better under those conditions than we used to. They tend to be a little bit lower nitrogen use, have a little bit lower nitrogen use efficiency. Their ideal temperature range for shoot growth is more in the 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit range. We do see sometimes they can have high disease incidence, especially in these summer months if we get kind of humid. And, a lot of times if we get, we wear down some of these cool season grasses, we're going to have to reseed, overseed, interseed to maintain the density that we desire with those cool season grasses. So it's all kind of pros and cons. And again, we have many different species that fall into each of these categories. This is kind of a snapshot. So, you'll see several familiar names in both columns. In some cases, you may see things you've never heard of before, and that may mean that they do better in a certain niche environment that we may not have here in Tennessee. Seashore paspalum, for example, as its name kind of implies, tends to be something we see mostly in coastal regions, right? Buffalo grass is a native grass we tend to see more in the prairies further west and throughout the Midwest. So it just kind of depends where we are in terms of which of these we'll tend to see kind of predominate. Now, many of you already know that Tennessee is in the transition zone. And what this means is we can grow both warm and cool season grasses equally poorly. We can't really do either very well. And so, it's just part of the fun of choosing your turf and all of that. That said, when we think about the Upper Cumberland region, what I did here is I ran some growth potential curves, and I did have to give a shout out to the Crossville Buckies because I'm from Texas, and Buckies is a Texas thing. So if I look at kind of the growth potential curves here, blue represents cool season grasses and the potential for those to thrive. Red represents warm season grasses. And you'll see in many parts of the Upper Cumberland, cool season grasses are really going to be probably the preferred grass for many of the counties in this region. You guys have just enough, maybe a little bit more elevation. You have the cooler temperatures to support that cool season growth. And that's why a lot of times we tend to see that the most commonly planted cool season grass in Tennessee for lawns is going to be tall fescue, particularly if we're not in the western part or the west region of Tennessee. So when we think about turf selection, I'll share a couple little tools with you guys. And if you're feeling like you really want to become a turf nerd, these will be good places for you to start. So there is a program called the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. Maybe you've heard of it before if you come to a lot of extension programs. This is a national program where there's variety testing of different turfgrass cultivars and variety testing for different turfgrass species conducted across multiple geographic locations. Many of those locations are tied to a university. So here in Tennessee, we do a lot of these INTEP trials in Knoxville. And recently, INTEP came out with what's called a Trial Explorer. It's a new tool that they've developed that allows you to more easily dig through some of the data that they have available. And so I can go in there, for example, and I can select from all of the different trials that have been conducted. If I'm really interested in tall fescue specifically, I can pull that up. I can pull it up for the most recent tall fescue trial. I can pull up data from older trials, and it'll generate an output kind of like you see here, and allow me to see how different varieties performed in different locations. So it just kind of gives me a sense of which ones are kind of top ranking. The ones that are highlighted in green are statistically top performers for whatever trial I pull up, right? So just kind of a fun tool. Another good resource as you're thinking about turfgrass selection is called the A-List. And the director of the A-List is actually here at UT, but this is a national nonprofit organization that really focuses on identifying and recognizing sustainable turf grasses that take into account all aspects of sustainability. So we can think about this as really a good way to identify kind of broadly low input grasses. And, when we dig into the research that's been done on what a lot of consumers like me or you are most interested in when it comes to a turf grass, it's what is going to be a low input option, whether it's because I'm looking at something that's more environmentally friendly and I'm looking to reduce inputs that I feel may be harmful, or it's just because I don't want to spend a lot of time and money out there putting things out on my yard. I want to mow it occasionally and otherwise do very little, right? And so this kind of helps to identify that. I put the QR code here as well as the website link. If you guys want to check it out, it has several lists of what they've identified as being these low input options based on a bunch of different research studies that have been conducted, particularly for cool season seeded grasses. And we'll talk about some of them tonight. So like I said, a lot of times tall fescue ends up being the best option for a lot of Tennessee lawns, depending on where we are. And I'll talk a little bit about Bermuda and zoysia grass tonight as well. We do see that zoysia grasses in particular can be very versatile. Again, a lot of this is going to come down to kind of what your goals are. So I would say with a tall fescue lawn or with a cool season grass lawn, we're going to see that primary growth occurring in the spring and in the fall. In the wintertime, when we're very cold, it's going to largely just sit there, but it'll retain a lot of its color. And then, the time that we're really going to see it potentially struggle the most, not necessarily die, not necessarily go dormant even, but sometimes struggle with disease or other symptoms of stress, is going to be in those peak summer months when we're real hot. And then particularly if we get dry. And so if my goal is to have something that's really green and lush in peak summer, then I may want to have a warm season grass. If my goal is to have something that's green, maybe for a longer duration and stays green during some of those winter months and cooler season months, then a cool season grass like tall fescue is typically going to be a better option. And tall fescue, we tend to think of it as a really relatively good low input option. And so again, we may see occasionally that it requires some supplemental irrigation if we go through a dry period or during those summer months. A lot of times we may need to add a little bit of water to it to keep it happy. We may see too that it can have some disease pressure issues that we may have to deal with. But in general, we tend to think of it as more of a low input option. It's going to have that thicker leaf blade. It's going to be typically something that we want to maintain at a taller mowing height. And so it's going to have a little bit taller, longer feel to it than some other grass species that we may be able to mow at a shorter mowing height. This has a bunch type growth habit. It can spread a little bit. It's got like some short rhizomes that can allow it to spread. But for the most part, it's going to be pretty clumpy. We can get really great, beautiful coverage, uniform coverage of it, but it's going to have that bunch type growth habit. Tends to do best in moist and fertile soils. So, what I did here is, like I said, there's been a lot of research and kind of updates to what we call turf type varieties of tall fescue. So, tall fescue was sort of introduced as a lawn grass many years ago. And one of the varieties that most people are very familiar with is Kentucky 31, which sort of was the bridge from the forage world into the turf world for tall fescue. And so, it was a very great low input option. It kind of helped introduce tall fescue into the turf grass world. But since then, we've seen a lot of kind of advancements in selection for varieties that may have more desirable characteristics, meaning that they may have a more appealing color. They may have a slightly finer texture, denser canopy, and may give us a little bit more, desirable aesthetic traits in a lawn situation. And there's been a couple of in-depth trials that have been conducted over the past couple decades. And what I've done is pull two of the most recent, and everything you see listed here is a variety that was a statistically top performing variety for both Tennessee and Kentucky. So we had some varieties beyond these that may have done well in Knoxville, but not as well in Lexington. We may have had some that did well in Lexington, not as well in Knoxville, and if you happen to be listening in here from West Tennessee, we may be more likely to look at the Starkville, Mississippi data as a corollary for some parts of West Tennessee than we might the Knoxville data, right? So this specifically identifies varieties that did really well in both Tennessee and Knoxville. And we may see these varieties, we may be able to purchase them individually. We may see them in mixtures. One of the questions that I got today is, where can I buy some of these new varieties? Can I find these at a big box store? And, some of these we may see in some big box store products. It can be more challenging, I think, sometimes to know what varieties are in those box store mixtures. They don't always put those on the label the way we might see if we purchase those from other distributors. And so, if you're looking to make an investment in something that's going to give you high quality, good performance, what you may do is explore. I'm not specifically endorsing any particular party, but I would look at local co-ops. I would look at local seed suppliers. I would look at some of the brick and mortar stores that are more focused on professional distribution of some of these lawn care products. And you may find more options going down those avenues than you might at a big box store. So just FYI there, but a lot of good performers. And then those that have a couple of asterisks after them are also on that A list. So that means that they've also made the cut as being one of those more sustainable varieties at the national level. Here is the whole A list for tall fescue. So these varieties, again, have been identified as good low input options. And they actually have done a nice job here of including the company that manufactures these, and so that's a good place to start to learn about where you can find some of this material. In addition to tall fescues, we do sometimes hear folks talk a little bit about fine fescues. I wouldn't say that we see these nearly as often in Tennessee home lawns. The main place that I've seen them so far is really going to be in shaded areas as part of a blend. The fine fescues comprise 5 cool season grasses. I've got them listed here, again, in general, they're not going to be quite as common. They may not be as compatible with our soil types here in Tennessee. They may not be as compatible with our summer temperatures here in Tennessee, but you may see them occasionally blended in as part of a shade blend. Here's the A-list recommendations for fine fescue varieties. If you're curious, you can also go visit their website and learn a little bit more. University of Tennessee hasn't been part of fine fescue in-tep trials because, again, it's just not a group that we tend to see a lot of here in Tennessee. But if you're interested in a little bit additional information, you can go to the in-tep Trial Explorer that I shared with y'all. And there are some trials conducted in Raleigh in North Carolina. That's probably the closest fine fescue trials. And so that may give you some sense of how some of these tend to perform in the transition zone. Most likely in the very near future, we will update. We've got a fescue publication available through UTK Extension, and this will likely get updated fairly soon. But it's got a lot of good information about some of these different fescue species, and it's got some good information about some of the older varieties that did well in previous in-teps. And so we'll add some of those some of that new in-tep data here, and you'll be able to use this as kind of a resource when you're hunting for fescues that do well here in Tennessee. So other cool season options, we do have the option to use things like perennial ryegrass, annual ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass can be a really nice option, particularly where I've seen it do very well here in Knoxville, is in more shaded areas. Sometimes can require a little bit different management approach. But again, it may be a good option just depending on your unique scenario. Annual ryegrass, there are some improved varieties, but a lot of times we think of this as kind of a soil stabilization tool or something that we want to use as a relatively cost-effective overseed option. And if you're looking for something that's a little bit higher quality to overseed into a warm season grass, I might look more at a perennial ryegrass as an alternative, which is what you see in this upper photo here. I should keep an eye on questions. I haven't been doing that. Do we have any questions about cool season grasses so far before I move on too far? Nothing in the chat? All right. So once we get past the cool season options, and I guess I'll just preface this by saying that if I am interested in a cool season grass, I'm interested in fescues in particular, as we move into September, that's going to be a really good time to plant. So really mid to late September is going to be an optimal time a lot of times for us to get a lot of these cool season grasses out. We'll get them seeded. They can get established. They'll largely just sit there over the winter time, and then they'll have the remainder of the spring to kind of grow out. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't see folks plant these in the spring, but it kind of shortens their window to really have an opportunity to get established. And so if we plant them in the late summer, early fall as an alternative, like I said, you get that kind of on-ramp through the fall for those grasses to establish. And they'll typically just, like I said, sit there over the winter time, and then they'll have that entire spring period to continue to establish before we get very hot. If we wait until March or April to put some of these out, we may be okay if we happen to get a milder spring or a milder summer. But if we happen to warm up very quickly, these grasses may have a hard time and may not be able to get established the way they need to do well once those temperatures increase. So zoysia grass is going to be a really good warm season option for the transition zone. A lot of the zoysia grasses that have been developed over the years were developed specifically with the transition zone in mind. I would say that they offer a little bit more versatility with cooler temperatures than, say, a Bermuda grass would most of the time. We see a lot of different types of zoysia grass available. Many of the varieties for zoysia grass are going to be vegetative varieties. So that means that we'll be able to purchase them as plugs or sod or sprigs, but we may not be able to find seeded options for them. In fact, the only two seeded zoysia grasses that I'm aware of are called Zenith and Compadre. They're kind of listed down here on this table. They're both going to be what we call zoysia japonicas, which I'll talk about more here in a second. And zoysia can offer a lot of benefits because we have so many different zoysia options. Some zoysia grasses are going to do better in shade than others. Some may do better in colder temperatures than others. Some may offer us reduced insect susceptibility. So zoysia grasses tend to not be very yummy to certain Lepidoptera insects like sod webworm and certain caterpillar species compared to something like Bermuda grass or some other species. We will see that zoysia grass can be prone to some disease issues, but other benefits include that a lot of times it may not need to be mowed at the same frequency, doesn't typically have the same nitrogen requirement of say, a Bermuda grass, so we can typically reduce the fertilization. And it does have a pretty good traffic tolerance. One of the bigger kind of drawbacks of zoysia grasses is that they can be fairly slow to establish. And if they are injured in any way, while they can kind of recover, they may be a little bit slower to recover than something like a Bermuda grass. So, Meyer, many of us are familiar with Meyer zoysia. Meyer zoysia has been around for a very long time. It's what we call a zoysia japonica. And a zoysia japonica is a coarse textured zoysia. So a lot of times we hear folks talk about either coarse textured zoysias or fine textured zoysias. And the coarse textured zoysias are going to have a thicker leaf blade. It's going to look a little bit more, the leaf blade thickness will be a little bit more like a tall fescue leaf blade. Whereas the fine textured zoysias or zoysia matrellas are going to have a much more slender leaf blade. So it's kind of the difference a little bit between like a tall and a fine fescue, sort of similar here. And increasingly we're seeing that the coarse and the fine textured zoysias may be crossed, and we may see what we call intermediate textured zoysias. So in addition to Meyer, which is a great kind of go-to, particularly for the transition zone, there's a few other options. So El Toro down here at the bottom, that's a zoysia japonica. I don't know that I'm not sure whether or not anybody is still selling that here in Tennessee, but it is one that we see quite often. There is a demo plot of it at PREC there on the plateau, if you ever want to go and check it out. It is a little bit older than some of the others that you see here. So originally it came out in 1984. Since then, we've had the release of at least these two other japonicas. Jammer is not one that I see quite as much here in Tennessee, but Palisades is very popular. And if you're looking to put zoysia in a home lawn, I would recommend Palisades. Okay, that's my go-to recommendation for homeowners. We get a lot of homeowners that think that they really want to find textured zoysia, but it has some unique management requirements that a lot of homeowners may not be able to do or may not be familiar with having to do, including they have to be dethatched on an annual basis. They typically have to be mowed with a reel mower at a high frequency in order to ensure that it can maintain a good cut and good upright growth habit. Palisades is going to be a little bit more tolerant of like what we tend to do as homeowners. We go out there with a rotary mower. We may beat it up a little bit. And so I'm a big fan of Palisades. I'm a big fan of Meyer. In addition to that, there is a new one that came out of NC State. They had some issues kind of getting it off the ground in terms of getting their breeding stock up. I'm hoping that that'll kind of change so that maybe we'll see this is more available next year and the following year. But it's called Lobo zoysia grass. It is a medium fine textured. So it's one of those I talked about where they've crossed the two. And so it's kind of the textures in between. But it's being marketed as a great low input zoysia grass option. And so we will be getting some of it at our research farm here in Knoxville. We'll get to play with it a little bit and see how it does here in Tennessee, but that's one to kind of keep an eye out for if you're really interested in some newer options. Another new option was a collaboration between Texas A&M and Kansas State. It's called Innovation. There is Innovation available here in Tennessee, and it is a true transition zone grass. It's going to, I would say, perform very similarly to Meyer, but it's going to offer some differences in terms of color and texture. It's going to be a very cold tolerant option, but it will require maybe a little bit more babying than some of the other japonica type zoysias like Palisades and things like that. Another kind of interesting thing to note, if you're a golfer on here and you're interested in the golf world, we are seeing increased utilization of zoysia grass on putting greens, which we didn't see for a long time. You know, creeping bent grass and ultra dwarf Bermuda grass were like the go-to two grasses typically that we see on putting greens, but there's starting to be some zoysia. We have 3 golf courses here in the state of Tennessee so far that I know of that have zoysia on putting greens. And so I think we're going to see more interest in that as well, which should be kind of interesting. All right, then we got Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass can be an option in many parts of Tennessee. You know, where I would recommend it the most is going to be in very exposed areas that have lots of sunlight, don't have a lot of option for irrigation, where you tend to get some dry areas, particularly if you're looking for something that's going to stay healthy during those warmer months. Bermuda grass is going to be a great option for that. Hybrid Bermuda grasses are typically going to be a little bit less invasive and have more desirable characteristics than common Bermuda grasses. And if I really want that high quality hybrid Bermuda grass, I'm going to have to purchase that typically as sprigs or sod. I'm not going to be able to find seeded options. Now, there are some improved seeded options for Bermuda grass that will give me some improved characteristics over a standard common. But in general, like I said, this is something that I would want to have in very exposed full sun areas that tend to be very hot, very dry, where I'm not looking to have to add a lot of irrigation. So again, got common Bermuda. Celebration's a variety that has been around for some time now. It's a common selection. So it's got some of the coarser texture of a common Bermuda grass, but it has a little bit more blue-green color, just a little bit of shade tolerance, but not much. Then we have Tifway 419. People refer to this as a lot of different things. Sometimes I'll hear it be called tiff grass or tiff turf. So, you know, if it starts with tiff, it came out of the University of Georgia breeding program in Tifton, Georgia. Tifway 419 has been around for, I don't know, 50 or 60 years now. It's been a very, very good hybrid Bermuda grass option. Because it's been around so long, it tends to be a little bit less expensive than some of the newer options. It's going to give you better density. It's going to give you a more attractive look, you know, good traffic tolerance overall. It can be hard these days sometimes to find really good pure 419 Bermuda grass because it's been around a long time and older grasses tend to mutate. They tend to have contamination issues with time, just as a function of age. Just like any of us, right? We may not all get better with age. So, you know, as we think about that more, there have been a lot of new Bermuda grasses introduced to the market recently in the past 10 years or so. So Oklahoma State has a Bermuda grass breeding program. They produce a lot of grasses that do very well in the transition zone. Kind of the big focus of their program is a little bit on water use efficiency. They do some drought tolerance work, but they do a lot of work on cold tolerance in transition season color, meaning they want grasses that green up earlier in the spring. They want grasses that stay green longer in the fall. So they've had 3 big ones that have come out of that program: Northbridge, Tahoma 31, and Latitude 36. We'll talk about each of these briefly here. So Northbridge, very fine texture, improved cold tolerance. It's in a few places. It's on the new PGA of America headquarters golf course in Frisco, Texas. Tahoma 31, Tahoma 31 was on the Super Bowl field this past year. What we saw at the Super Bowl is not the fault of Tahoma 31. But unfortunately, you know, we had some announcers that made that connection on TV. And so we had some folks that have made comments about it this past year. But or a lot of other things that went into that. But Tahoma 31 in general here in Tennessee has been a very solid performer. It exhibits excellent cold tolerance. I'll show you guys some data here in a second. If I'm looking to, I really want to have Bermuda and I'm in, the northern part of Tennessee, this is going to be a good option for me where I'm experiencing those cooler temperatures. Latitude 36 Bermuda grass is another nice one. I don't know how much I'd recommend that one, maybe for a home lawn scenario. But it is the grass that we have at Neyland Stadium. So if you're curious what it looks like, that's what it looks like. There's also Tip Tough. This is a relatively new University of Georgia release. This one is extremely drought tolerant. So we saw this one actually perform very well over the past year because it survived the drought from last summer very well. It was in a better position going into the winter because it was in healthier shape than some other grasses because of that drought tolerance. It's a really good option, good drought tolerance. It's pretty versatile, may not offer the same degree of cold tolerance in general as Tahoma 31. Iron Cutter is another relatively new Bermuda to the market, also a very good option. So a lot of good hybrid Bermuda grass options if I'm looking for something new, high quality. There's a lot of things at my disposal to explore. It's just a matter of thinking about what are my priorities. Is my priority that I want something drought tolerant? Is my priority that I want something cold tolerant? Is my priority that I want something low input? There's no one size fits all grass, a lot of different things that can fit well in different ways. I'm going to kind of move through some of this fairly quickly, but this is in-tap data for some of these varieties that I've just talked about. Those that have asterisks by them were kind of top performers in different categories. So this kind of gives you a sense of how some of these perform under traffic, under cold, under drought stress. You can see Tip Tough is a real standout in the drought department, but it kind of blends in with some of these others when it comes to some of these other stress tolerances. When I look at winter injury, they did some trials in Kentucky and Indiana. And the big takeaway is this. So when we saw 98.5% winter kill of Tifway, which is kind of the standard, all right, 88.3% winter kill on Tif Tough. So we were seeing these really high values. We only saw about 14.5% winter kill on that Tahoma 31 averaged across the two sites. And in fact, in Indiana, if you look here, they only saw 4% winter kill of that Tahoma 31 compared to 98% on Tifway. So big difference in cold tolerance between that Tahoma 31 and Tifway 419. So if I really want a Bermuda, but I'm a little gun shy after some of the cold temperatures we've had, Tahoma 31 may be a good option. Iron Cutter and Latitude may not be bad options. Tip Tough may be a great option if I've got some drought issues. So again, it's just thinking about what you're specifically looking for. So once we kind of identify what we're interested in, we want a soil test. There's a lot of different reasons that we do this. The big reasons are we need to have a baseline for what is going to be needed to have successful turf grass growth. And, one of the things that I always tell folks, we think about if we go to the store and we spend money on a new azalea or we spend money on a new tomato plant, we're going to come home and we're going to take time to set up an environment for that plant to thrive in, right? We're going to amend the soil. We're going to till it. We're going to dig a really nice hole. We're going to plant that plant and tuck him in with some mulch and some soil. And typically with grass, we're just like throwing it on something compacted and full of trash and telling it good luck, right? And so it speaks a lot to the resilience of grass that we can do that a lot of times, and it does very well. But in the long term, if we're going to make the investment of buying new seed or sod, and particularly if we're doing a renovation because we've had a really frustrating experience, we want to understand what is our soil like and how can I improve it to ensure the long-term success of this grass. And the best place to start with that is going to be to conduct a soil test. This is going to give me an idea of the pH. So one of the things that you guys may or may not be familiar with or have worked with or dealt with before is, a lot of times we may need to lime soils here in Tennessee. And in order to understand how much lime is required and what that program looks like, we've got to do a soil test. And we'll talk a little bit about liming. Soil test is also going to tell me what's my baseline in terms of what nutrients are there. It's really hard for me to build a strong, effective fertilizer program if I don't know what nutrients are already available and already there in my soil. right? And so that's going to be a great place to start for that. And I may learn some things too that I didn't know about my soil. And so best way to do this is for Christmas this year, on your wish list for Santa, or whatever holiday you celebrate, ask for a soil probe. Okay. I know that's going to be the number one item now on your wish list for your next big event, but soil testing probe is going to allow me to more easily collect multiple soil samples across an area. We want to tend to avoid digging a hole in one corner, right? Because when we do that, there may be something really unique about that corner that's not reflective of the rest of my yard. So I really want to have a good average of what's happening across the area I'm managing. I can choose to do the front yard and the backyard separately if I want. If I'm not going to change the way I manage the two, I'm going to do everything the same, then I can combine samples across the two in one sample. So I'm looking at taking a 5-gallon bucket, going out there with my soil probe or just a hand trowel or a spade. And I'm looking at collecting about 10 to 15 samples across that area that I'm looking to manage to a 6-inch depth. I'm going to pull out any big debris that's in there. I'm going to, combine all of that material together, package it up, and send it to our Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville. And if you go to this QR code, it'll actually take you directly to the page that's focused more on lawn and garden sampling. It'll provide you with some instructions for their recommendations for how to collect samples, how to send samples in. You can also work with your local county office to do this as well. And so this is, again, very important first step. And this is something that I would recommend doing well in advance of planting. Remember, it's going to take time for them to process your sample, take time for you to get those results. And then depending on what you find, there may be kind of a long period there. It can take a while sometimes for us to modify the pH. If I happen to be very acidic with my soil and I'm going to need a lot of lime in a fairly intensive program to get that pH to where I need it to be to have a successful lawn, I'm going to want to know that well in advance. So, give yourself several weeks prior to potentially doing a renovation to collect your samples and send them in and get those results back. And then my general recommendation is, as a general rule of thumb, it's good practice to soil test about once a year for your lawn. This is going to help you monitor the success of a liming program that you implement. It's going to help you adjust your fertilizer program year to year as needed. We may see that one year we don't need to apply any phosphorus, right? And I may be able to get a much cheaper fertilizer product that if I don't need phosphorus than if I'm needing to get that phosphorus. So I want to know those things before I invest money and time into putting something out. Other tools that are kind of fun to play with. This is the NRCS Web Soil Survey. So this allows you to actually go in, you can put in an address and generate an area of interest. I assume everybody's yard looks like this golf course here, right? So I can generate an area of interest. And then the cool thing about it is it'll actually, based on survey data that's been conducted over the years, tell me a little bit about the different soil types that are in the area that I've mapped out. Now, depending on, if I'm at a fairly small residential lawn, I may not be able to get down to that scale, but I may be able to capture my neighborhood. If I have a larger property, it may be a little bit more, lend itself a little bit better to that. And I can go in and click on any of these unique soil types, and it's going to give me information like, what does that typical soil profile look like? What's my depth to a restrictive feature? How far before I hit bedrock? Which I may already know if I've been digging around, but it's going to give me some idea there, which is kind of helpful. Okay. Now, when I do get my soil test results back, again, liming may be something that I've got to consider to improve the quality of that soil prior to establishing new turf grass. There's a pretty good publication about this. I'll share the link with you here in a second that Dr. Samples put together, who was my predecessor and is like a complete legend. But again, the reason that we may have to do this is sometimes the soils here in Tennessee are so acidic, meaning the pH is so low that it actually affects the availability of the nutrients that our plants need to grow. And so, a lot of times we may not appreciate how many different essential elements are required for plant growth. We actually estimate about 18 to 23 essential elements are required to support plant growth, provided through a combination of air, soil, and water. And so as you can see here, if I become too acidic, certain things become less available. If I become too alkaline or my pH gets too high, certain other things become less available. And so I'm looking for kind of that middle ground. You know, a lot of our turf grasses tend to do best in something that's just slightly acidic. It's where we tend to see a lot of the best availability of nutrients and best performance of our turf grasses. So, you know, if I do my soil test and I'm down here at a 4.5, I'm probably going to need to lime to try to bring that up into something that is going to ensure that I have better nutrient availability. There is, like I said, a good publication about liming where you can get more information. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all liming program. Again, it's really going to come down to what's your starting pH and what are your goals? What are you working toward? And this publication does a nice job too of talking about different grades of product and how easy it's going to be for some products to break down, to become available. And so it's a good resource if you're looking for that. In addition to that, there's been a lot of research that's come out over several years that has talked about the benefits of organic material. So just like we would put compost into our vegetable garden, we may see a benefit, or we definitely would potentially see some benefit to incorporating good, high quality organic material prior to planting new turf. Now, this can sometimes be sort of cost prohibitive. You know, if I'm trying to plant new turf on an acre of land, this is probably not going to be feasible. But if I've got a fairly small area that I'm trying to prioritize as my pride and glory, and I really want it to do well, and I've got a really heavy clay soil that's difficult for me to get good rooting in or difficult for water to move into, incorporating in a high quality compost material prior to planting may offer me a lot of benefits. And so according to the research, we'll see that it improves the structure of the soil. So we get better water infiltration, better water movement. It can increase the amount of water that's available to plants, the amount of nutrients that are available to plants in some studies. There's like a whole summary of it here in this publication. It's a literature review and it's a scientific publication, but it is available to the public. So if you're just curious about this, you can go and check it out. They summarize several studies that were conducted looking at incorporating compost materials into different soil types. And so it's pretty interesting. So, you know, typically what I recommend to folks is if you can't afford it, again, you know, I don't know that I could afford it all the time depending on the size of the area, but if I could get a couple of inches of compost incorporated, tilled into the upper 6 inches of soil prior to planting new turf, I'm going to see some benefits there according to the research. Now, if this is not feasible for me, another way that I can get these benefits that may be a little bit more cost effective is to top dress with compost. So once I establish my yard, you know, it's up and running, maybe this year I'm just looking at interseeding, I can top dress and put out, you know, 1/4 inch of screened high quality compost over that turf area. And in particular, if I'm combining that with something like aerification, I can see a lot of benefit from that top dressing, and that aerification may help it move more into the soil for me to get those benefits. And that over time may help improve some of the characteristics of a soil that I otherwise find difficult to grow in. All right, so we're getting toward the end here. So if my plan is to renovate this year, so we've picked the right option for my yard. If I'm interested in the fescues and I'm interested in the cool season grasses, like I said, you know, we're moving into an optimal time to plant those. We could also plant early in the spring next year, but like I said, you may shorten your window for establishment. It could be a little bit of a gamble, okay? If I'm interested in Bermudas and Zoysias or other warm season options, the best time to plant those is going to be late spring, early summer next year. So looking for those temperatures that are conducive to growth. Remember, we talked about that 85 or higher, 80 or higher for zoysia grasses. You know, we're looking to plant in a window where we're going to encourage that establishment under those warmer temperatures. If I'm looking at seeding, this kind of gives you a glimpse of what some of those seeding rates may look like. You know, there's a lot of things that may go into that. And again, there's a great University of Tennessee extension publication from Dr. Samples that talks about planting turf by seed. And some of those seeding rates are going to vary a little bit depending on my seeding method. Remember that one of the things that we're really looking for in order to have success with seeded turf grasses is we want that good seed to soil contact. And so whether I'm starting with a fairly bare soil, or I'm trying to interseed into something that's established, I'm going to want to try through either some kind of mechanical process, or scalping, depending on what the current scenario is, to increase the likelihood that that seed is going to come into direct contact with the soil. Now, I've talked a little bit about tillage and soil amendments. It is important. I don't want to make sure I don't go over time here, but it is important to remember that while we want the soil to not be compacted, we also can't afford for it to be too loose, because then we're not going to have a nice uniform turf surface. So you're looking at having something that is firm but not compacted. You're taking the time to properly grade it once you've incorporated in your amendments, making sure that it's settled, ready for planting. Then you choose your planting approach. In addition to seed, we can also plant vegetatively. This is going to be the only option for some varieties, like some of these Bermudas and zoysias we talked about today. I'm only going to be able to plant as sod or plugs or sprigs. And so, similarly, I can prepare that area, make sure it's level, firm, uniform, and I can go out and put these things out. I would say sprigs are a great option for Bermuda grass. Maybe wouldn't be my first pick for a zoysia grass because of that slower growth. Similar for plugs. I don't know that it would be my first pick for zoysia grass. If you're looking to invest in zoysia, I would probably go with sod. Not to say you couldn't be successful with another option, but I think it can take a lot of time and you may not get the uniformity that you'd like in that surface compared to planting some of those alternative approaches with Bermuda grass. Now, a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. Depending on how you plant, depending on what you plant, there will be a period of watering in during establishment. If I plant from seed, I need to be watering frequently enough that I'm keeping the surface of the soil moist, because that's what my seed has come into contact with. So I want there to be enough moisture there for that seed to imbibe water and germinate. And that may mean fairly frequent, but very light watering, again, just to maintain that moisture layer. We don't want to water too heavily, because then that can cause the seed to float and move. And so kind of light misting until we start to see some movement toward establishment. Typically, you're looking at monitoring this fairly closely for about 2 weeks, and then you can start to gradually scale back on that watering and move toward more deep and less frequent irrigation. If I'm watering in sod, for example, my approach may be different, where I'm really looking to try to get sufficient moisture to wet the upper 2 inches of the soil below the sod. And again, I may be looking at doing that for the first couple of weeks. I'm monitoring. I don't want it to become squelchy. I don't want the sod to float. I just want enough moisture there to encourage those roots to grow. As soon as I start to feel that sod tack down, meaning I'm pulling on it and those roots are getting in there, as soon as I start to see that it's ready to be mowed, I can start to scale back a lot on that watering. Fertilization, last thing I'll say, is, again, based on your soil test, sometimes pre-plant phosphorus is required. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we'll get enough of the phosphorus freed up from changing the pH that we don't need to add any more phosphorus. Typically, I don't recommend pre-plant nitrogen for turf grass. Nitrogen is so dynamic that unless we're concerned there's really none there in the soil, a lot of times it'll be gone before that turf grass tries to take it up if we incorporate it prior to planting, unless we're using an organic form of nitrogen or some kind of slow release nitrogen. And just remember that as your turf grass is getting established, it doesn't have the roots of a mature grass. So typically we recommend spoon feeding, lower rates, maybe more frequently, until that grass exhibits, demonstrates that it's more established. Okay. Chris, I feel like I talked too much, but I'm happy to stay as long as we need if we have questions.
Well, Dr. Bowling, I really appreciate that information. I do have one question, because I've been getting some questions from some cemetery committees in my area asking about the Zoysia grass, because one of the things that piques their interest is you don't have to mow it as much, which means they don't have to have that mowing expense as much. Is there a certain variety, that you would recommend or think about, or?
Yeah. So for that situation, and there is actually a cemetery out in West Tennessee that recently adopted zoysia grass. And so I've gotten to kind of see what that looks like in action. For that situation, I would probably go for either Palisades, Meyer, or maybe El Toro if they can find it. I think those, like I said, those japonicas, those coarse textured zoysias are typically going to be a little bit more tolerant of kind of a standard lawn management approach. And so it should give them kind of the benefits of a reduced mowing frequency, but they won't have to baby it in other ways the way they might with some of the fine textured zoysias. So like I said, I'm a big Palisades fan. Meyer's also a great option. And then we may have some other new options hit the market here over the next couple of years.
Good deal. I guess they asked me that question because they see my yard and I don't mow it a lot. So, that's probably why they asked me that question. Does anybody on the Zoom have any questions for Dr. Bowling? I don't see any in the chat. Well, Dr. Bowling, you must have answered everybody's questions.
Or they all fell asleep.
I don't think they did that.